So today we're going to talk a little bit about the two events that the Torah records in the life of Yaakov and Esav. Yaakov and Esav are twins. They come out looking very differently. They develop different personalities. And story number one is when Yaakov acquires the birthright from Esav. And story number two is when Yaakov takes the blessing from Esav. And it's very important that you understand these are two different stories. Story number one occurred when Yaakov and Esav are 15 years old. And Yaakov is cooking a pot of lentils. And Esav comes back from the hunt. And Esav is very, very hungry. And he asks Yaakov for the lentils, and Yaakov says, I'll give you the lentils if you sell me your birthright. And Esav declares, behold, I'm going to die. Why do I need a birthright? And he sold his birthright to Yaakov in exchange for the lentils. Now, this occurred when they were 15 years old. So first of all, let's understand a few things. Why is Yaakov making lentils? So Rashi explains that lentils is the food that you give a mourner. When a person is in mourning, you give them something oval. We typically give eggs, but that's the same idea. Because what is the idea of something oval or something circular? That times change, right? Life is like a circle or an oval. There are bad times, but there will be good times. The galgal, the wheel of fortune, turns. And Yaakov is making, so why is Yaakov making lentils? Because he's comforting his father Yitzchak. Why is he comforting his father Yitzchak? Because Avraham had just died. Avram had just died. So we could figure out, this is how I knew. You may ask me, how did I know that Yaakov and Esav were 15? Because let's figure it out. Yitzchak was born when Avram was 100 years old. Yitzchak had children from Rivka when he was 60 years old. So when Yaakov and Esav were born, Avram was 160 years old. We know that Avram died at 175. So Avram died when Yaakov and Esav were 15. Right? You see the cheshbon. That's how we know it. So first of all, what is a birthright? What did Esav sell to Yaakov? It is not a reference to a double portion of inheritance or anything like that. That comes later in the Torah. The birthright is actually the idea that before there was a Mishkan, before there was a Beis HaMikdash, there were no Kohanim per se. Obviously, there are no Kohanim. Aaron is not in existence yet. But the firstborn of every family had the right and the privilege of the divine service, of bringing sacrifices, of leading prayer and the like. In other words, the Bechor took the place of what later would become the Kohen. So this was a spiritual role. Esav didn't want it. See, people raise the question, well, did Yaakov take advantage of Esav's starvation? Esav is starving. Esav says, I'm going to drop dead. Give me the lentils. And Yaakov was withholding the food. Some people understand it that way. And they say, oh, look at Yaakov. This is another example of Yaakov taking advantage of somebody. I wouldn't call it deception, but it's more coercion, by basically withholding food from a starving person. First of all, if Esav wanted to take the food, he just would have taken the food. What, Yaakov is going to stop him? If Esav's hungry, he'll just take it, right? So that's not what's happening here. And when Esav says, behold, I'm going to die, why do I need the Bechorah? Esav doesn't mean I'm going to drop dead. Rather, there's a spiritual message. Esav is saying, after you die, that's it. There's no afterworld, there's no olam haba, there's no heaven, there's no God. So the purpose of life is to eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we will die. So Esav says, what do I need this spiritual stuff for? And that's why the Torah says, Vayivez Esav es ha-bechorah. That means Esav despised the birthright. It's not that he gave up something that was precious to him because he needed food. Rather, he didn't care. It wasn't worth anything for him. In other words, you understand, Hinei anochi holech lamus, I'm going to die, doesn't mean I'm going to drop dead right now. It means life is just physical. All there is the physical. After the physical, there's nothing. So what am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to enjoy whatever I can enjoy in this world. Who needs this spiritual stuff? Right? That's Esav. So that is event number one. Now, it's interesting. Chazal say, and there are two ways of understanding this, like it's a chicken and egg problem. Maybe you covered it. That Esav did not openly become a rasha till the day Avram died. This is Esav's coming out, so to speak, that he denied God and the like. Now, there are actually two ways of understanding it. One way of understanding it is that he was going to become a rasha today, one way or the other, and that's why Avram died, so Avram would not see Esav becoming a rasha. That's how Rashi seems to understand it, because Rashi says Avram really should have lived 180 years, like Yitzchak, but God took him early, so he should not see Esav become a rasha. The implication of Rashi is Esav would have been a rasha, one way or the other, so God took Avram early. But you know, I think there's maybe an opposite way of understanding it. It's not that Esav would have become a rasha whether Avram lived or died, and therefore God took Avram early. But maybe Esav became a rasha when he lost his grandfather. In other words, maybe I'm psychoanalyzing it too much, but I think there's a certain validity here. Here you have Yitzchak and Rivka. They were married for 20 years. Both of them are very, very righteous and holy people. They have two kids, twins. Yaakov is studious. Yaakov learns Torah. Yaakov serves God. Esav was not yet a rasha. He was not yet a rasha, but Esav is hunting, and Esav is playing basketball, and Esav is wandering the streets. You could understand that even if Esav is not a rasha yet, Esav is a profound disappointment to his parents. Esav is a failure in his parents' eyes. And Esav probably feels that. So what kept Esav in the fold for 15 years? It was the presence of his grandfather. Maybe you have that in your own experience, as it often happens, that adolescents who are troubled in life, and they don't feel they can relate to their parents. Right? Their parents have a certain demands, certain disciplines. But often they can find refuge and understanding with a grandparent that they can't automatically find with their parents. And I like to think, and again, I don't have a particular proof, I offer it as a speculation, that as long as Avram was alive, as long as his Zaidi was alive, Esav had a certain measure of security, a certain measure of comfort, a certain measure of acceptance. When his grandfather died, he no longer had that acceptance. And then everything broke. He became a rasha. So this is kind of the opposite of Rashi. Rashi seems to be learning Esav was going to be a rasha today, whether Avram was alive or not. So God took Avram, so Avram should not see Esav become a rasha. That's how Rashi seems to understand the sequence. I'm suggesting maybe an alternative understanding, that Esav would not have become a rasha as long as his grandfather was alive. It was only when his grandfather left, he no longer had anyone who validated him, anyone that supported him, anyone who saw the good in him. Because it's important to understand that Esav was never a masmid who was going to sit in the Beis Medrash. But Esav too had potential. Esav too had certain qualities. We're going to come back to this. And those qualities perhaps were not seen by Yitzchak and Rivka so much, because their dream was to have the Yaakov type boy. And they didn't, and Esav was not the Yaakov type boy. But Avram was able to let Esav see a certain validation. Again, maybe this is too modern of an explanation, but I think it has real application in real life, because this is actually an issue that exists in religious families all the time. Where, some children love learning and some children gravitate to Torah. Other children are good kids, also good kids. I'm not talking about, evil children, good kids. But, they're, at least at that stage in their life, they're not into all of this stuff. And that sometimes creates feelings that they're rejected, that they're second rate, and that can have devastating consequences. That can make things a lot worse than they had to be, meaning things could have been much better had there been a certain amount of acceptance, right? If you look at the phenomenon in the Orthodox community that's called off the derech, kids at risk, whatever term you use, it's a big thing. It's a big thing in America, it's a big thing in Israel, I assume it's a big thing in the whole world, wherever there are religious communities. And this is often how things start. A kid is not necessarily so cut out for the yeshiva world, gets rejected, gets pushed away, and then things can spiral in a very bad way because there's no acceptance. Okay, but be it as it may, that's event number one. Now, let me ask you this. This is something we don't really see from the Chumash. If Esav sold to Yaakov the Bechorah at the age of 15, right? This is not right. So l'chayra, wouldn't this have to be something by definition that Yitzchak and Rivka knew about? Because after all, being the Bechor is a public idea. You're the one that officiates. I'm not sure exactly what the services were, but when there would be a religious service, the Bechor would officiate at the religious service. So l'chayra, if Yaakov bought that Bechorah, so that means whenever there was a religious family get-together, Yaakov would lead the davening, so to speak. So one point I want to point out is that I think by its very nature, this would not have been a secret transaction. It would have come out. And you'll see why I think that that's important as I go on. Now, let's now look at story number 2. Story number 2, you wouldn't know it from the Chumash, but story number 2 is many, many, many years later. In fact, according to Rashi's calculation, Yaakov and Esav are 63 years old. So story number 1, they're 15. Story number 2, 63. Right? Was it 48 years later? Now, here, Yitzchak thinks he's on his deathbed. Now, it's also important to know that even though you get the impression that Yitzchak's about to die, Yitzchak, in fact, will live many years longer. Again, let's figure it out. Yaakov and Esav were born when Yitzchak was 60. Now, if Yaakov and Esav are 63 years old, that means Yitzchak thinks he's dying at the age of 123. I mean, that's right. Yitzchak's age in that second story is 123. Yitzchak lives till 180 years. In fact, Yitzchak is alive when Yosef is sold, all sorts of things. So that itself is very interesting. The Chumash does not give you any explanation why Yitzchak thinks he's going to die. But in point of fact, he's going to live in more than 50 years. Okay. But Yitzchak thinks he's going to die, etc. So he wants to give a special blessing to his son Esav. Because Esav is the Bechor, the firstborn. Even though Yitzchak would seemingly know that Yaakov bought the birthright, but he says Esav is the Bechor. And Rivka does not want Esav to get that bracha, so she has Yaakov disguise himself like Esav and wrap goat skins on his arms so there's a hairy arms and the like. And Yaakov impersonates Esav. And Yaakov gets the bracha. And then Esav shows up. And Yitzchak says, too late. Sorry. And in Or Samech, we often discuss, Rabbi Gottlieb discusses, other people discuss, what are the proofs that the Torah is from God? Maybe it's a man-made document. So I like to say maybe it's a bit humorous. But to me, the best proof that the Torah is from God is that if we would be writing our own story, we would never write it the way the Torah writes it. We would not write that Yaakov got the blessings by deception. We would not write how the brothers sell Yosef. We would not write the sin of the golden calf. Meaning to say, there's so much that is apparently critical about the Jewish people that, it must come from God, because people who write their own story tend not to incorporate all of those negatives. So the whole story of Yaakov getting the brachos by deception, by lying, by fraud, is very, very strange. But I want to start off with a preliminary question. Why did Yitzchak want to give the brachos to Esav? Did Yitzchak think that Esav was the bigger tzaddik? Did he think Esav was more righteous? Now, some midrashim actually understand that Yitzchak was fooled by Esav. Number one, Esav was very meticulous, and this is to his credit, in honoring his father. Esav is actually a prototype of kibud aviyim. Esav also used to ask very frum, very religious questions, which didn't make sense, but they indicated he was very, very strict. He would say, how do you take off truma and maser from straw and salt and water? Which, of course, you don't have to take truma and maser from straw, salt, and water. From questions. But this is very difficult because there are a number of textual indicators that Yitzchak knew that Esav was not a righteous person. Let me give you a few of them. Number one, right before the story of the brachos, it mentions that Esav married 2 Canaanite women from Ches. And it says, beferish, this was a source of bitterness to Yitzchak and Rivka. So Yitzchak sees Esav is doing a very serious aveira here. Number one. Number two, if you remember the famous scene when Yitzchak is not sure who's standing in front of him and he feels the arms, so he says, Hakol kol Yaakov. The voice is the voice of Yaakov. Hayadayim, the hands, the arms. Right, by the way, this is interesting linguistically, that the word yad in biblical Hebrew does not always mean hand, it means arm. First of all, one very good proof for that is tefillin. Ukeshartam lios al yadecha. You should tie the tefillin as a sign on your yad. Now, we don't put the tefillin on our hands. I mean, we tie the strap, but we don't put the bias on our hands. We put it on our arm. So it's important to know that in biblical Hebrew, the word yad is not always a hand. It also includes an arm. Okay, and here too, it's the arms, right? So what does Yitzchak say? Hakol kol Yaakov. The voice is the voice of Yaakov. The yadayim are the hands of Esav. So what does Rashi say? Rashi says, it's not that Yaakov and Esav had different voices. They were twins. Their voices were the same. But the manner of talking was different. Because Yaakov always mentioned Hashem in his speech. Esav never mentioned Hashem. And here, the impersonator in front of Yitzchak mentions Hashem's name. So Yitzchak says, you're talking like Yaakov, even though your hands are Esav. Now, what does that mean, though? That means Yitzchak understands that Yaakov mentions Hashem, and Esav doesn't. So he couldn't have thought Esav is a more righteous person. Hakol kol Yaakov. By the way, as an aside, just as a little digression, let me remind you of the famous drasha that the Gemara gives us about Hakol kol Yaakov v'yadayim Esav, which is very relevant to our struggle now. And that is, it's not just referring to Yaakov and Esav, it's referring to the Jewish people in their struggle against the Umos HaOlam. And that is, our power is in our voice. That means our Torah learning and our prayer. The Yadayim, brute force, is the Koach of Esav. Meaning to say, we have to understand that although we need an army, and again, I'll say over and over again, how every Jewish person must be very, very grateful to the Chayolim, who are Moser Nefesh, who do risk their lives, religious or non-religious, to protect Eretz Yisrael, to protect Jewish people. And if a person does not appreciate the sacrifices of others, that is called kafui tov, an ingrate. And that's one of the greatest sins in Judaism, is not to have hakaras hatov. So of course, we should do whatever we can for the chayalim, whether it's giving them the medical supplies they need, or the clothing that they need, or whether religious things, the tzitzis, quite amazing how tens of thousands of chayalim want tzitzis. And I'm not just talking about the Shomer. I mean, the Shomer Shabbos ones already had tzitzis. So we're talking about people who, were not necessarily observant. And many of them want tefillin, a smaller number, but still, thousands of them want tefillin as well. So whatever we can do for the chayalim, whether it's food, whether it's books, whether it's military supplies, whether it's medical supplies, whether it's religious things like sidders and tefillin, of course, we have to do. But we also have to realize that ultimately, the victory of the Jewish people comes not through military power, but it comes through Torah and mitzvos. And that's what it's Chazal say, HaKol Kol Yaakov. Yaakov's power is through the kol, the voice of Torah, the voice of tefillah. Yadayim, physical strength, is the quality of Esav. Okay, but be it as it may, I'm just bringing you a proof that Yitzchak was aware that Yaakov was spiritually greater than Esav, because Yitzchak says, Yaakov mentions Hashem. And then, the third indicator is the fact that if Esav sold the Bechira, presumably Yaakov publicly was the one that was officiating at religious services. So if Yitzchak understood that Esav wasn't so great, so we're back to square one. Why did Yitzchak why was it Yitzchak's desire to give Esav a bracha? So, here is the thing. This goes back to the idea that although Yitzchak and Rivka both knew that Yaakov was the rabbi of the family, Yaakov was the spiritual person, Yaakov was the tzaddik, Yaakov was the one who learned Torah, whatever that meant exactly. It's not even so clear. What does it mean to learn Torah? There was no Torah per se, but whatever, learn godliness, learn ruchnius, learn spirituality. But Yitzchak saw in Esav certain powers. Esav also had talents. Esav also had goodness. Esav was not a person who could sit in the base medrash. He needed to play basketball. He needed to run around. But Yitzchak felt that Esav had talents that were redeemable and could be used in a good way. Just as I said before, Abraham saw that. Now, going all the way back to the beginning of their lives, there's a phrase that says, Vayigdalu hana'arim. The young boys were raised, and Esav became a hunter, and Yaakov became the dweller of tents, meaning studying Torah. Rav Hirsch says a vort, and whenever I say this, I get in trouble, because how dare I say it about the avos, so I always have to emphasize, Rav Hirsch says this is not me. Rav Hirsch says, you know why Yaakov and Esav went in different paths? Because they were raised the same. Vayigdalu hana'arim. We have twins. Both of them were put in the Beis HaMedrash. Both of them were told they have to learn 12 hours a day. And that was good for Yaakov. But that was not good for Esav. So says Rav Hirsch, when you try to make an Esav into a Yaakov, not only aren't you going to get a Yaakov, but you're not going to get the Esav that you could have gotten in a good way. So that was a mistake. The Yigdalu Hana'arim, Rav Hirsch says, to raise them the same. So many, many, many years later, 63, Yitzchak is trying to rectify the mistake that occurred so many years before. And Yitzchak is thinking of a division of labor that is very similar to what later occurred among the tribes Yisachar and Zevulun. This is, of course, later. If you remember what Chazal say, Yisachar was a tribe that was primarily involved in the learning of Torah. Zevulun was involved in commerce and business. But Zevulun used its resources to help Yisachar. And because of this, Zevulun has a share in all of Yisachar's Torah. This is called the Yisachar-Zevulun partnership. Now, of course, that doesn't mean Zevulun doesn't have to learn. Zevulun has to learn also, but predominantly, Zevulun was in business, and they were machzik Torah. Now, that's Yisachar and Zevulun. That's much later with Yaakov's children. But Yitzchak envisions the same type of idea. Yitzchak says like this, listen, let me give Esav a bracha, meaning he'll get Eretz Yisrael. He'll dig the ditches. He'll plant the fields. He'll have the army. He'll engage in politics. Esav is a go-getter. Esav has energy. Esav wants to be involved in conquest and expansion. So I'll give Eretz Yisrael to Esav, and he will use his resources to help Yaakov learn and teach Torah. And Yitzchak's cheshbon is, this is a good deal for Esav, and it's a good deal for Yaakov. It's a good deal for Esav, because Esav will never be the guy who sits and learns Torah all day. Esav is restless. Esav is, activist. Esav has energies. Esav cannot sit still, right? ADHD, whatever it would be. So I'll give Esav a whole land to cultivate, to build and plant and hunt and do all the activities of society. And that way Esav will have his ruchnius in the support of Yaakov. And Yaakov, on the other hand, will be freed of politics, freed of military responsibilities, freed of the burdens of society, so that Yaakov can be panoi, to learn Torah, to teach Torah, to inspire. So Yitzchak was envisioning something that was very similar to what later became the Yisachar Zebulun partnership. He wanted to create a Yaakov and Esav partnership. And indeed, there is a medrash that says it was God's original plan that 6 tribes would come from Esav and 6 tribes would come from Yaakov. That the Jewish people would have been a partnership of Yaakov and Esav. Of course, they wouldn't have been called Bnei Yisrael at that point. Yisrael is one of Yaakov's names. I'm not sure what name they would have had in that consolidated nation. But Bnei Yaakov Esav, I'm not sure what we would call them. But there was such a cheshbon. So Yitzchak, and that's why the Malbim points out a very interesting point. If you look at the bracha that Yitzchak gave Yaakov when he thought he was Esav, you will see that that was a bracha only in Gashmias. God should give you mitala shamayim, the dew, prosperity, success over enemies. Meaning, Yitzchak never intended to give Esav a spiritual blessing, because he knew that the spiritual work was Yaakov's job. He only intended to give Esav a bracha in Gashmias. Now, later, when Yaakov is leaving to go find a wife and is trying to escape Esav, Yitzchak does give Yaakov a blessing. May you be the successor of Abraham. So says the Malbim, that bracha was never going to be given to Esav. That bracha was always Yaakov's bracha. But Yitzchak's havamina is that the bracha of Gashmias, of Eretz Yisrael in particular, I am going to give to Esav. So now you actually see something of, it's a very moving idea. Yitzchak loves his son Esav. Yitzchak loves him. And Yitzchak regrets the mistakes that were made in not giving Esav a path where he could flourish. And Yitzchak is now trying to fix that, to give Esav a makayim for redemption. So, sounds good. So what's wrong with that? What did Rivka see wrong with that plan? The short answer is, too little, too late. Had this been the way Esav was raised as a child, it might have worked. But at this point, Esav was off the derech, and if Esav would have been given the brachos of Eretz Yisrael, he would not have used those resources to benefit Yaakov. He would use it to oppress Yaakov, just as the Romans who come from Esav, when they conquered Eretz Yisrael, they didn't use it to help Am Yisrael. They used it to oppress us, the Churban Beis HaMikdash. So, in a sense, one might say that Esav did fool Yitzchak, but in a much more subtle way. Esav did not fool Yitzchak, that Yitzchak thought Esav was the more righteous son. Yitzchak was not fooled in that. Yitzchak knew that Esav was not doing so good. But Yitzchak thought Esav was still redeemable. and could use his kochos for Yaakov. And it was Rivka. Now Rivka knew deceivers much better. Rivka grew up in a home of liars and cheaters. So Rivka had a greater ability to see through duplicity than Yitzchak did. In fact, some even learn that that's the meaning of the idea that why was Yitzchak blind? He was blind from the tears that the angel shed at the Akedah. Right? Rashi brings the Medrash. So metaphorically, some understand that Medrash to mean more spiritually, that when he reaches the level of being a sacrifice to God, and he's literally more of an angel than a man, he's blind to the world of sheker, the world of lies, the world... In other words, Yitzchak has reached such a high level that he doesn't understand deception. He doesn't understand duplicity. That's the meaning. He was blinded by the tears of the Akedah. So, seen in this way, the story of Yaakov and Esav, instead of looking at it like, oh, Baruch Hashem, the good guy won, triumph, victory, I think we look at it a little bit of a tragedy. It was a tragedy that it came to this, that there could have been alternative scenarios where there might have been a partnership, there might have been a collaboration, there might have been a zechus on each side. And indeed, that could be why Chazal ultimately say that B'acharis Hayomim, in the end of days, Yishmael will do tshuva. That's our main enemy now. In fact, some say the Abrahamic Accords were actually a step in the tshuva of Yishmael. And of course, it's been well said, I think, that a part of the, Hamas doesn't need a motivation to kill Jews. They want to do it all the time, but part of why they did it now is that they had heard that Saudi Arabia was on the verge of a peace treaty with Israel, or a diplomatic treaty with Israel, and they had to derail that. That they couldn't allow to happen. So the Abrahamic Accords are now kind of frozen, but they were a step in Yishmael doing tshuva. And there's another medrash that Esav will do tshuva b'acharis hayamim too. So like everything will come back then. But at least in this world, Rivka says we can't give Esav that bracha. So this is a tragic story. This is a bit of a sad story in terms of what could have been. In a way, the whole Torah is a tragic story. The Eitz Hadas, right? We're put in Gan Eden. What could have been? Right? The Torah begins with the notion of the expulsion from Eden. And all of world history is an attempt to get back into the Garden of Eden, to try to find your way back. And, we'll get there. We will get there. We will get there. But, it's a very convoluted, twisted road till we come back to Eden. And that's what Geula is about. That's what Mashiach is about. And that will even include Esav and Yishmael in terms of their doing tshuva, b'acharis hayamim, and coming back down. By the way, the Meshech Chachma says, fascinatingly, he actually says that the very first step to Yishmael, I don't mean the person Yishmael actually did tshuva, but the nation of Yishmael, the Arab nations, he actually says it was the conversion of the Arabs to Islam, or the invention of Islam, because the Arabs before Muhammad were pagans. Right, in Avram's time or whatever, they were pagans. So Islam, with all of our criticism of Islam, and there's so many bad things in it, the one thing in its favor is it's monotheistic. That's why halachically you're allowed to go into a mosque, even though you're not allowed to go into a church. In fact, if you go to Hebron, right, I don't know if you've been to Ma'aras HaMachpelah, maybe it's not the safest time to go, but a mosque is built over the tombs of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. It's an awful thing. But so when you daven in Ma'aras HaMachpelah, you're davening in a mosque. Now, how are you allowed to go into a mosque? The answer is that Islam is not idolatry. So I'm not allowed to walk into a church because that's a makom of avodah zarah. And people always ask me this question. I'm visiting Rome. I'm visiting Vatican City. Can I go into the Sistine Chapel? The short answer is, unfortunately, you cannot go into the Sistine Chapel because it is a functioning church. Now, things that are no longer churches, they turn into museums, that you can go into. But if it's a place where they still do Christian worship, you cannot go in. But you can go into a mosque. So the Meshech Chachma actually says the first step in Yishmael doing tshuva was the movement towards monotheism all the way back. And the second step will be making peace with the Jewish people, which was the Abrahamic Accords, which Hamas is trying desperately to sidetrack and destroy. Okay, so that's one point. Now, the other point I want to make, though, is this, that, you read the story and you say, oh, Baruch Hashem, Yaakov gets the brachos. But number one, there is a problem that Yaakov did get it by deception. Yaakov did get it by fraud. How could that be? So the emissaries, the Medrash says that Yaakov suffered because of it. That when you gain something by improper means, even if it's the right thing to do, it was the right thing to do, but the means were tainted means, there's going to be a cost. Number one, Yaakov suffered at the hands of Lavan's deception for many, many years. Yaakov worked 7 years to marry Rachel, and the night of the wedding, Lavan switched, and Yaakov gets Leah. And Lavan cheated Yaakov with the sheep and the different calculations over many years. And then when Yaakov comes back to Eretz Yisrael, what happens? Yosef, his son, is sold into slavery, and Yaakov is deceived into believing that his son is dead. So what do we see? Midah keneged midah. Yaakov gained something by deception and lying. Yaakov is victimized by deception and lying. He who lives by the sword dies by the sword, as the expression goes. Moreover, Chazal say, when Esav comes back and Esav sees there is no, Yitzchak is not going to give him the bracha, it's very poignant. So what does it say? Vayizak, Za'aka, Gedaila, Umara. Esav cries a loud and bitter cry. Chazal say that identical expression, or virtually identical expression, appears one more place in Nach, and that's Megillas Esther. When Mordechai hears of the Gezerah of Haman against the Jews, Megillas Esther says, puts into Mordechai's words, Vayizak, Za'aka, Gedola, Umara. The Gemara in Megillah says, because of the pain that Yaakov caused Esav, Esav's descendant, Haman, because Haman comes from Amalek. Amalek is Esav's grandson. Right? So Esav's descendant causes Yaakov's descendant the same pain that Yaakov had caused Esav. Now, what does this mean? Is this punishment? Is Yaakov being punished? It wouldn't be punishment because Lamaisa, it was the right thing to do. It had to be done this way. So you have to understand, as Rav Chaim Shmulevitz explains, this is not a matter of punishment. This is a matter of consequence. Let me give you an example. Let's assume there's a big fire, and I run into a building on fire to rescue a baby. And Baruch Hashem, let's say I did. Did I do a good thing? Yes, it was a noble thing, it was a wonderful thing. But just because it was a wonderful thing, does that mean I'm not going to get burnt? Usually not. So a person might say, oh, why is God punishing me for rescuing the baby? God is not punishing you for rescuing the baby. The natural consequence of going into a fire is you get burned. Once in a while, Hashem will do a supernatural miracle, like Avraham in the fiery furnace. But usually, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not operating on the level of supernatural miracles. This is what I mean, that something is a consequence, not a punishment. You're going to get burnt when you rescue a baby, not because you did anything wrong, but it's a natural consequence of what you did. So here's the thing. The same way you have natural consequences in the physical world, you play with fire, you burn your hands. There are consequences in the spiritual world, and that is the pain that we cause others comes back to bite us. Even when the pain that we caused was a justifiable pain. See, justification is not relevant here. It's a consequence. It's a law of spiritual nature. Yaakov hurts Esav. It's going to come back in some way. Now, that doesn't mean you don't do it. You have to do it. But by definition, therefore, you try to minimize causing pain to other people. You try to minimize. Right? If you take Israel's situation, right? Unfortunately, many civilians die. Some of them, of course, many civilians are terrorists too. I mean, the whole dichotomy between civilian and terrorist in the case of Gaza is a very confusing category because, many of them are terrorists either way. But there are some, I don't think we can deny it, there are some who are not. But it's very important that we try to minimize to the degree that we can without compromising a military objective. And that's what Israel does. I mean, Israel, to their great credit, no other army in the world does this. They give warnings to evacuate. I mean, so Hamas even knows when bombs are coming. They give warnings. Now they're involved in a hospital, complicated maneuver where they have weapons and tunnels in hospitals, but there's also patients. Hamas set it up. There are patients in the hospital. So Israel is like going in, like surgical, trying to, get the terrorist, get the tunnel, get the weapon, but don't, hurt the person on the next bed in intensive care. I mean, it's virtually an impossible thing to do. But people our chayolim are trying to do it. Because once again, even if your objective is a justified objective, when you cause pain, it comes back to haunt you. That's the lesson of Yaakov and Esav. The final point I just want to share with you is that the one thing I really haven't answered is, why was it necessary for Yaakov to use fraud? Why? I mean, Yaakov is known, especially Yaakov is known in our Messiah based on a pasuk in Micha as Emes LeYaakov. Yaakov is Bedafka, the man of truth. So here Rav Hirsch adds a very interesting nekuda. Part of why Yitzchak didn't want Yaakov to be involved in politics and society, right? That's why he wanted to divide it, give Esav the Gashmias, and Yaakov the Ruchnias, is that Yitzchak felt that Yaakov did not know how to function in a world of deception and fraud. And the world of realpolitik and the world of political intrigue is full of sheker, full of deception. Yitzchak felt Yaakov could not navigate that world, keep him in purity. So Yaakov needed to show his father that I too, I'm a man of truth, to be sure, but I too am capable of lying and cheating. What is the purpose of that? Because if I'm capable of understanding that technique, I will not be victimized by it, meaning to say it will not destroy me because I understand the nature of that game. So it first says the whole idea was that when Yitzchak finally realized he was deceived, he validated Gam Baruchia. He validated the bracha. In other words, Lamaisa, Yaakov got the bracha through Yitzchak's consent, meaning at the time he gave the bracha, Yitzchak didn't know. But when he realized what happened, he said, Gam Baruch Yiyah, he too shall be blessed, meaning Yitzchak himself validated the bracha that he gave. So it first says the deception was to assuage Yitzchak's concern that Yaakov could not function in a world of sheker. Just as Yitzchak, Aliba Diemes, could not really function in a world of sheker. Okay, so again, these are very, very rich parshios full of different ideas, but hopefully this gives you a little bit of clarity on the story of Yitzchak and Yaakov and Esav, and the brachos and the deception, and what was Yitzchak's Hava Amina, and why Rivka was able to convey that this was incorrect. So I'll have a good Shabbos.
Thank you for listening to this Awesome production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.